This is Jody King-Colgrove with Quantum Techniques, and I appreciate that everybody's joined us today, and you may be listening to this in the replay. I've got several people on today that wanted to listen to like why we should be eating the certain foods that we do and what foods may be impacting us. So I work with people all over the world, helping them understand why they have a health issue and what they can do about it. So our subject that we're talking about today is regarding foods and how we test foods using applied kinesiology to find out if they're benefiting us or if they're hurting us. And so I'm going to kind of open your eyes on the different categories that we test on and why certain ones are good or bad for our system. So if you are listening to the replay, you can send us questions and I can help answer those. And that will help us kind of know, get your questions answered. So starting again, the questions that are the different food categories that we test on. The first one is against a symptom. So if you are not sleeping well at night, we would test all the foods that you're eating to find out if one of those is adding to your issue. So an example would be is my husband, if last night he didn't, but if he snored, then I would find out, okay, what is causing his snoring? And so typically I find out that if he eats dairy, it kind of stops up his mucosal lining and his cranial nerves, which are 5 and 7 in the face, and also 2. And so he snores because it kind of locks it up. It also locks up cranial nerve 12 and his phrenic nerve right here. And so it makes all that whole area stuffy. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting is if you make this area stuffy, the sinuses, it also can impact your urinary system. So you may be getting up in the middle of the night to pee more than you would have, and that could be an inhalant. And so specifically last night, we had a fire in the backyard, and so that smoke smell kind of got into my hair and my husband's hair, and then we laid down on the pillow and went to sleep. Now, I got a good night's sleep, so did he, but today I just made a conscious effort. I wonder if that inhalant on that pillow is going to affect us tonight, and sure enough it did, so I just changed out my pillowcases. So that was a side note, but I thought you'd like to know that. All right, so that's a symptom, testing against foods against a specific issue, which is snoring or sleeping. The second area that we would test foods for is energy toxins. So those are typically trauma-based. So in other words, if you eat a food, you will be reversed. And so you'll be in a fight or flight. So an example that we like to give on this one is if when you were a child, your dad came home drunk, and so you had a fear about being near him or getting hurt. So you would run out into the cornfield to hide as a protectant. Well, then you're going to be bad on corn, okay? Because that corn is a reason why you have a trauma. I've wondered if some kids are bad on certain foods because as they were eating those foods as a child, they were watching more cartoons like the Roadrunner that is a little bit more, violent and things like that. And so they may be bad on certain foods because of trauma that they would have. Or if their parents were fighting in the background while they're trying to eat foods, they may be bad on those foods. So that's an example of a trauma-based food response. Then those are something that we can clear. And so that way we're not always bad on that particular food. So I think that's kind of an important point, that there's sometimes foods we can get back. And we also are always working at Quantum Techniques to find out what is the underlying issue on your food sensitivity so that we can clear that, so hopefully get some foods back, okay? The next thing is testing that food against a specific stressed organ. So for example, if your genes in some way or an issue that you've had that is reoccurring, like a lymphatic issue, it doesn't drain very well, or you have a lot of bladder infections, or you just have a lot of brain fog, we would test certain foods against those particular organs. Not so much the symptom, but it is kind of part of that, but against that particular organ, gland, or tissue that may be sensitive to you or to your genetics, okay? So we would keep that in mind also and see if it makes it more weak because of that. This can, okay. So then the fourth one, two, three. The fourth category is whether it creates a histamine response. So a lot of times you'll notice that people eat strawberries and then they'll get hives, okay? What is that? That's a histamine response. Sometimes people eat a certain foods and they start choking. In other words, it starts swelling up their airwaves and they're not able to breathe. That is a histamine response. So we would find out what is that food that's creating it and why. It could be a spice that's actually on the food. And typically, a lot of those are either an immune system response that we need to clear up the immune system, or it's also trauma-based. So those are an easy food to help clear and find out what's going on. But there is a time where you have to not eat some of these foods, all the different categories I've been through, as your body's repairing and healing. All right, so then the fifth way is whether it causes inflammation and hurts your immune system. So the first one is causing inflammation. So I have a specific dessert that I really enjoy. But I've found that if I eat it in the package that it was shipped in, which is a plastic, I tend to react to it more. And so I'll get a bit of bloating, okay? So I'm just aware that there's something going on in my stomach at the moment, or my intestines, that is inflamed right now. So I need to maybe go and find out, okay, what is the food that caused it? Now, I've done some research and I already know what that is, but I got a hold of a bad cucumber, okay? And this kind of gets down to some of the things I'm going to discuss in a little bit, but I will give you an example before we get there. So when we go to the store, how do we know which vegetables we should eat and not? So if you know how to muscle test, you can test to find out, like for this particular cucumber, how bad it is with pesticides and, not having, if it's not organic or organic, how good or bad is it? So this particular, usually most cucumbers for me will test about a 5. Okay, I don't have a way of getting organic cucumbers where I live. But if I get ones that are the English kind, then they tend to be a 5 out of 10. So that's right on the borderline. It's not bad, but it does have, issues. And so I just clean it really good and am aware that I am getting some kind of it's not as good as it could have been, or there was not as much nutrition in it as it could have been. Well, this particular cucumber that I got was the good kind, but I forgot to test it in the store. And sure enough, it had a lot of pesticides on it. And so it really impacted my mucosal lining in my stomach and created a lot of inflammation. And so when I discovered what it was causing the inflammation, I cleared that. And that's what we do at Quantum Techniques is we have a specific code once we've identified what organs involved, what the toxin was that involved it, whether there was a bacteria that was also involved, and we let the body know, okay, let's let go of that. We don't want it to impact you anymore. So, but that inflammation was already there in my intestines as it was healing. So then I tested all the foods, which I normally are okay on this particular dessert that I had. Usually tests fine, but because of this particular issue causing inflammation in my body, it wasn't testing good. So that's an example of how we test for inflammation in the body and whether there's a food that causes that specific inflammation. And it may be one of the things that you're just dealing with it at the moment. So for an example, I had a situation where like lymphatics were not testing as good. And so I had to find what food was bothering that. And that's because it had inflammation. And so we were kind of trying to decrease the inflammation. So that's one thing that we always test. The immune system, obviously right now, that's really important that we test to make sure that everything that we're taking in is not impacting the immune system. And obviously things that, if you've read anything about health, the things that impact the immune system are things like omega-6s, which deal with like vegetable oil, safflower oil, and fried foods, and also sugars. And so those are things that you don't want to take into your body right now if you're trying to have a really strong immune system as we go through with the coronavirus. I think we're tired of saying that, coronavirus. So anyway, so we would test things to make sure that nothing is impacting that immune system and driving that lower. Okay, so that would be another thing that we would test. One thing to be aware of when we test is we find out an organ typically functions on a scale from at a 10, okay? So we test as intestines at a 10, mucosal lining at a 10, but there are some exceptions to that. And the two exceptions is the heart tests as a 12, and the cerebellum, which is the back of the head, which deals with the chemical makeup of the body and the balance of that, tests as a 17. So we're always testing that inflammation to make sure that the inflammation is not over that, or it's too sluggish and it's under that. So we're testing that to find out. So that's kind of a part of that. And then we sometimes recommend certain herbs and remedies that is helpful for bringing down the inflammation, like turmeric and vitamin D and things like that. And so I wanted to kind of go back in omega-6, and I had just kind of we know that omega-3 helps you reduce inflammation. So omega-6 actually increases inflammation. So I was just kind of, when I was getting ready for this talk, I was thinking, okay, let's think about vegetable oil and thinking about that with your immune system. And sure enough, it tests weak. And this is how I test, okay? So I test, okay, well, how much harm is eating something with vegetable oil fried, like a French fries or a chicken nugget, be bad for the immune system? And I got a -5 of harm. So I thought that was kind of interesting that that would impact your immune system that way. And I had never thought about kind of like testing it that way, but I thought that was interesting. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now we're going to do the 6th area, and that's whether a food is bad for a fungal infection. So we have viruses and bacteria that can impact us, but the other thing that impacts us is also a fungal infection, and it can really not allow digestion to work well. It can make us more sensitive to things in our environment. And make us more susceptible to viruses and bacteria and get lots of different symptoms. So we test to find out whether you have a fungal infection, and then we test certain foods to find out whether it's driving the fungal infection to continue or whether it doesn't impact it. So an example of that would be, fruits a lot of times have sugar in them, so they can increase a fungal infection. There's certain fruits that are really high in sugar and some that aren't so bad. So if we find that someone has a fungal infection, then we test to see which fruits will be okay. So the 3 lowest fruits are pears, apples, and blueberries. And so we test to see if someone that has a fungal infection, if they can tolerate those foods and how much of them. So if you have a severe fungal infection, there may be no fruit at all. But typically I find that if someone has a fungal infection that they're really trying to knock down, they can still have an apple or 1 serving of blueberries a day, which is about a half a cup to a cup. And we can test that to find out. And so we have certain foods that we test to find out if you can have them when you have a fungal infection and not continue to drive it. So the last one is dietary intolerance. So there are some genetics that some people just aren't used to ingesting certain foods. And one of those is like the Pima Indians from Arizona. They are not farmers, they're hunter-gatherers. And so they never had dairy and dairy cows as part of their whole genetic makeup as a culture. And so therefore they don't do very good on dairy, and they actually don't have the enzymes to digest dairy. So a lot of them do have diabetes and are obese. And right now they're having quite an issue with the coronavirus in the Navajo and Pima Indian culture because of the obesity and the pre-existing conditions they have. And so that's one thing to consider. Is what is the dietary intolerance that someone has genetically. Another way that this shows up is if you have too much pathogens and toxins in your digestion, then you will have a dietary intolerance. So where I've typically found this is if someone has too much virus, bacteria, and fungal in their intestinal tract, then they will be bad on certain foods. And so what we have to do is say, okay, don't eat these things for a period of time as your body starts recovering and gets back into homeostasis. And so that's why I was saying there's a lot of these foods that we can clear right away, or we have to clear the trauma before we can have you eat them. Some we have to actually bring back the microbiome or the internal terrain of your digestive system to get that back into balance so you can start ingesting these foods. And so those are all things that we look at. Like I said, what we're trying at Quantum Techniques is to find out why you're having an issue and what we can do about it. And so that's part of that detective work that we do with muscle testing. So as I mentioned, with foods, what we're trying to do is find out how much benefit or harm a food can do for you, besides the categories we just went through. So an example would be that if you are going to a birthday party, or I like to use the example of donuts just because I live in an area where they love donuts. It's really odd because I'm not used to that. So when I go to church, they usually have donuts that you can have. Well, typically the donuts where they get them from, I have tested them for me and my body, and I find that the donuts, because of the wheat and the glyphosate and the Roundup that's in that wheat product, it's a -5 of harm. So I'll usually get a headache, I'll get brain fog, and I'll have low energy. So when I look at that donut, it looks so good sometimes. But when I muscle test, I can find out, well, that's a -5 of harm. So it gives me the power to choose, hey, I really don't want to feel this way. But there's other times that I test a different donut, and that donut's only like, doesn't test bad. And that helps me know, hey, I may not have to eat, or I could eat this particular food, and it's not going to impact me as much. So I get to choose for my health whether I really want to have that food in my life or I don't. And so I think that by able to muscle testing using applied kinesiology, we can find out whether a food is going to impact us too negatively, I should say, or how much it's a benefit. So that's an example from the different foods, but see how this goes with, water intake, because we do other things besides just testing foods. We test things like your water, beverages, your, believe it or not, saliva. I found that, our mucosa lining is our biggest defense against disease. And so we test a lot of times, how is the saliva or salivatory glands, what is their immune system, so that when we take in that food, is it hurting our body and not allowing us to have a really good digestion? So that's where it starts. And the reason that we know this is a lot of muscle testing, but my son is a teenager, and so he tends to put his fingers in his mouth and not wash them first. So he will get bacteria. So if that's reversed, then it kind of like affects the entire system. So very interesting to kind of find that. So things that we also test that people could be bad on is shellfish, chocolate, peanuts, GMO foods, spices, pesticides, supplements, and medication. And I think that's where I wanted to kind of bring that in, is that when we test a food, we're testing to see, or a supplement, we're finding out how much benefit or how much harm. And so that's really helpful for being able to find out, well, this particular supplement test is a 1 out of 10. Well, if it's just 1 out of 10, then it's maybe not as beneficial than something 5 out of 10. So you can choose whether you want to spend your money on that. Okay? So that's some of the reasons why I think that being able to muscle test to find out what the benefit is and what harm is really helpful. So I appreciate the people that have joined, and we're kind of more at the end, but where you can listen to this again. So thank you for joining, Becky. And I'm not sure quite how to say, it looks like Yaletta Carmen. So thank you for joining today. You're welcome to, if you have some questions, you're welcome to leave it in the chat, or I don't know quite how to have people raise their hand, but you can unmute you if you need to. And I can ask a question if you raise your hand. I can see it probably. Okay. So the last thing that we usually test is whether we have a nutritional deficiency or an excess. So that's another thing that we can test to find out whether you need to have more vitamin A or vitamin C in your life, or whether you're getting an excess of too much zinc, or too much, and so it's not having a good balance. So that's one of the other things that we can test with muscle testing. So, all right. So that's kind of the questions that I had, and explaining kind of how we test for foods. And so if you have questions, you're welcome to do it in the chat. And so for those people that just joined, I can just kind of run through the list real quick, but it's good to go through and listen to this. But we test foods on 7 different categories. So we test foods against the symptom itself. Okay, so whether you're not sleeping or snoring, as an example. We test foods to find out whether you have a toxin or an energy toxin to it. So in other words, it reverses you and puts you in fight or flight. Okay, a third way, and that's usually trauma-based, and it's very easy to clear that. The third way is that we test whether you have a specific organ that is a generational component that has run in your family as being weak, or that you've had a health issue with a specific organ. So we tested food against that particular organ. Number 4 is whether you have a histamine response to it. So if you eat strawberries and you get a histamine response, or your throat closes up. That's number 4. Number 5 is whether a food creates inflammation in the body, and also bothers the immune system, so that you can't have really strong health. Number 6 is whether it causes a fungal infection or increases a fungal infection in the body. And so we're usually testing the foods that usually create or cause a fungal infection to really exponentially increase in the body, and how much your particular body can take or not take. Okay. And then number 7 is whether it's a dietary intolerance. In other words, you may have too much fungal, parasites, pathogens like virus and bacteria that are not allowing the mucosal lining or the gut to actually digest the food well. It's like stuck. And so we need to get that back in balance. So there's certain times that we can't have you have certain foods in order to get that back in balance. So we test it against that dietary intolerance. And when you hear people saying that, oh, I'm gluten intolerant or dairy intolerant, that's what they're talking about. And so we can test to find out if you are and if you aren't, and then work on that and then see if you can get some back. Sometimes, like I was talking about the Pima Indians in Arizona, they have never been dairy farmers and they're hunter-gatherers, and so they don't have the enzymes to digest that. And so that's sometimes what will happen, and not be able to digest that food. And so that's just part of your genetics as a person. And I always suggest that people, read the book Grain Brain by Dr. Palmetter, because it really does explain why wheat is having such an issue in our society today. And a lot of times people can go to Europe and they don't have a problem with the wheat there, but they do have a problem here. So there's lots of different issues that he covers that I think are really good. I think another book that's really helpful about foods is Food, What the Heck Should I Eat by Mark Hyman. I think that he does an awesome job of it, going through each category of food and helping you really understand what foods are good for your body, and why. And sometimes there's just myths out there that we're not aware of. And so it's important to kind of know why foods test good for us and why they don't. So, and it helps with our food choices. Like I go to my mother-in-law's and they have fish. I'm like, oh, it's nice to have fish, but it's, and I may be saying it wrong, but it's tapia. And they say that tapia is just like one grade up from the bottom feeders, and so they take on a lot of garbage and they don't have a lot of detox the fish itself, and so therefore you're eating all that fish and those toxins, and so that's not good for your body to help. And so then at the end we kind of covered that we can test each food for you, or a supplement or a medication, to find out how much benefit is for you. And I think that's what I really enjoy about quantum techniques, is because we can test to find out, okay, if you have a supplement that you were really interested in getting, we can test and find out, okay, that supplement, as long as we see the pill, or you know someone that has taken that, then you don't have to open the bottle, but if you don't know anybody and you're just kind of going off for recommendation, then we do have to open the bottle, actually look at it for your body, and we test to find out how beneficial is it for you, up to a 10, or how much harm is it for you. And I found it both ways. And sometimes I've found that there's a medication that tested good for my son and only tested to have it once. And then it didn't test good anymore. But we also found that particular medication really bothered his stomach. And so I've had to do some mitigation on his stomach for that. So it's very interesting to find out how foods and medications really impact our body. So we have about 10 minutes left. And so if you guys have any questions, you're welcome to, like I said, leave a chat. Hopefully I've answered a lot of your questions that you might have. And I can take everybody off mute if they want. I think I've allowed everybody to control their own mute if need be. And you're always welcome to raise a hand if you haven't. So does anybody have any questions? Well, maybe I covered them all. But if you do have any questions and you don't want to, say in a group like this, you're welcome to contact me at jody@quantumtechniques.com. And I work with people to help them determine why they're having a health issue and what they can do about it. And so we have for first-time clients to Quantum Techniques, you can have an hour's worth of testing on your particular issue. We have you fill out a client history, so we kind of know what you're dealing with. And so we do an hour's worth of testing to find out what's going on and what foods to eat and what pathogens. So you really get some answers on what is going on. The full, I call it kind of a baseline, and we do that for $200, and it's a first-time special. So that's what we do at Quantum Techniques, and you can visit quantumtechniques.com. So it looks like we have a question here from Deborah, and it says, is there always in-person testing? So I assume what you're asking is there always, and I'll unmute you in case we need to you have control of that yourself. Okay, so in other words, I'm testing you specifically, and yes, you are working with a practitioner at Quantum Techniques, and we would test you specifically. So we would find out what that is. I hope that helped answer your question. So in other words, I would be testing you over the phone, finding out for your symptoms and what you're dealing with, what is going on. Okay. So yeah, so it's an in-person testing. It's not a machine that we use. We do our own muscle testing, and we find my particular one is this muscle here, and I push down. I can push on this side. That's just my particular one that I like. There's gazillions others that you can do. You can do the O-ring test. You can do the one I think is just fascinating is where someone can take their finger and put over the whether it slides on the top of the fingernail. And if it's a false questions, it will get stuck. And I find that fascinating, that even the hairs on your finger and the top of your nail will indicate that. To me, that just is really powerful. So hopefully that helped answer your question. All right. So I'm grateful for everybody that came tonight. And if you, have more questions, you can let me know. So is it in person? I mean, in an office? No, actually, at Quantum Techniques, we have always done everything over the phone remotely. So I work with people in Germany. I work with people in Australia and England, up in, Wisconsin, people in California and Utah. And so they call me up and they say, okay, we want a session, and so I work with them over the phone. We do record the session. So you can listen to it again and again in case you missed something. Some people use that session to do a retreat to themselves. In other words, they retreat their issue that they might having by listening to it again. And then we give you a specific code at the end to help, and I call it the acupressure code. And so once we've found out what's going on with your body, we give you an acupressure code like an EFT, if you've heard of emotional freedom techniques, which I am also trained in, and that it represents how to put your body back into a healing state. So we have a specific code for you that you would tap or read every single day to put your body back in a healing state. So yeah, so that's what we do. We do everything over the phone, which makes it convenient because then, you know, you're where you get to be, wherever you want to be. I've tested people in cars and at home and, you know, at work and wherever they can have a moment. So yeah, it's really fun. And then we just have office app, you know, I just have on-call hours. My particular hours are from 9:30 to 4 Central Time, but in the summers I go to Pacific Time. Yeah. So great. I'm glad I was able to answer your question, Deborah. So great. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate Lanny being here and Becky and maybe say Yetta and Patricia. So I'm just grateful you all joined today. And I just hope that that your life is blessed today, and that you're taking care of your health and happiness. And one thing that I've just really during this whole time has really been profound for me, so I want to share that to you, is to do a blessing. And so the blessing is kind of a Ho'oponopono prayer from Hawaii, and it just says, I love you, please forgive me, I'm sorry, thank you. And I found that if I pray that every day, I actually do it while I wash my hands, that it's really a sense of just being able to recenter, to love on people, love on yourself all at the same time. And so I hope that's a blessing for you. So thank you everyone for joining, and it was great to see everybody. It was nice to see you, Lanny. I haven't seen you in so long. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Have a blessed day. Bye.